Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the last event for Palace of Malta, titled Trump, Treaties, and Tension, the Future of International Law in the Middle East. I'm very honored to introduce to all of you Dr. Al-Marashi, who is an expert on all things Middle East, including climate change, technology, and hydropolitics, which is just named a few things. We will be listen to a lecture by the professor, and then we'll open up the floor at the end for 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A.
All right, well, thank you. And no, thank you for clapping. And I just, for undergrads, this is how I always kind of get them to kind of concentrate. I don't have this problem, but we do need a bit of meditation after dealing with this subject, because this is the title of the lecture I'm giving. But realistically, this is what I really wanted to call this lecture: Trump, Treaties, and Treason. Okay, now the treason is basically you're getting my argument in terms of what the future Trump administration means for international law. This is also a pitch. Your institution, whether it's an undergraduate or your school specifically, needs a history of law course. Yeah. This is my philosophy of history. Studying history will sometimes make you uncomfortable. Studying history will sometimes make you feel deeply upset. Studying history will sometimes make you feel extremely angry. If studying history always makes you feel proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. And so this is my goal today. I want to upset you. If you are angered after this historical overview, then I've done my mission. Why is a history of law course so imperative in your program? Think this is an entire discipline based on precedent, right? It's precedent that determines international law. Furthermore, this is a lecture to understand the future of the Trump administration and international law. You have to understand the past, not just the past of the first Trump administration, but more importantly, the 2 terms of the Bush administration around the 20th century. And this is my argument. You also have to understand the history of imperialism, that a lot of what we call international law have evolved from an imperial tradition of state. Okay, so that was my first acknowledgement about history. Now, my second acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I want to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. This land acknowledgement is also the perfect setup for this lecture. And you see, who are the Kumeyaay Nation? They are a nation without a state. And really, this lecture is not only about this nation without a state, it's about another nation without a state, the Palestinian nation, of course. I'm going to then be looking at what does nation and statehood mean in international law. Now, something else is going on in this land acknowledgement. This is a nation divided by 2 states. This is a nation divided by partition that has an imperial legacy. In this case, it was manifest destiny. In this case, it was Spanish imperialism. This is a nation divided into 4 states. I'll tell you what are the 4 states. First, we have the United States of Mexico. We forget that it is the United States of Mexico. Then we have the United States of America. Then we have the state of California and Baja California. The state of Baja California, yet we do not have a Kumeyaay state. A nation divided into 4 different states. In other words, that's 4 different administrations ruling over a nation. Why is this land acknowledgement that I got from a fellow USD professor? This was Kate Dimitrova, so shout out to you, an art historian. It was so valuable because I also wanted to let you know about this event. A poster designed by a colleague in communication, Borders of Grief. So when I show you that border, look at the border that this professor draws between Mexico and the United States, Israel and Gaza. This Borders of Grief, remembering the forgotten. I want to place, so this was an event that was recently occurring on your campus, and I want to situate both of these images of maps with the following. Where were some of the first borders created? So to go to the history of international law, so basically you're getting a mini history course, as well as then a mini international relations course. I want to show you this territory here. You see no borders, right? What you'll see is the following. Basically, the highway to Europe, so this is your old-fashioned geopolitics, the highway to Asia, and the highway to Africa all come to a narrow fulcrum here. It's a strip of land. It's not an accident that we refer to this land as a strip. Do you see how this strip of land is basically what guarantees you access from Africa to Asia to Europe? It all comes at this single fulcrum. From this bird's eye view, what am I going to show you? It was here that we have the first evidence of international law being born. If it was a contested zone back then, you can understand why it's a contested zone today. And it was around this time when two empires, the Hittites and the Egyptians, were fighting over. And I want you to notice where their ceasefire line is. If they could establish a ceasefire then, why is it so hard to establish? I want you now, this is what you're seeing on the map. Now, this is the question we have to ask. What mechanism established that ceasefire? This is the first treaty we have a record of in human history. The interesting thing is this, the treaty signed on the Hittite side and the treaty signed on the Egyptian side are a bit different. But the point is, it was enough to guarantee an end to the fighting. This is what we could call archaeology and international law. Now, the thing is, already there's a misnomer because you're going to have to understand the nation is a modern invention. So for all intents and purposes, we could say it's not really international law, it's inter-imperial law. And look at the argument I'm going to make, right? Whether it is inter-imperial law, okay, in the 1200s BC, all the way going to the eve of World War II. It's laws of empire that dictates international law. This is the Treaty of Kadesh, 1259 BC, and I argue this is when international law was born, or inter-imperial law, because keep in mind, yeah, there were no nations back then. Here you get the biggest problem in politics, and I underline it. So basically, I'm breaking down this treaty into 4 sections. And what do you need in a treaty? First of all, you need to highlight the parties to a conflict. In other words, this is what we call conflict management. So first in any treaty, you highlight the parties, and then you highlight their issues. What are they fighting over? Okay, I'm not going to read this, but Hattusili represents the Hittite Empire. And then the Egyptians are represented by the pharaoh. Oh, what a name. Matre, set of Enre, the great ruler of Egypt. Notice he's not saying the president of Egypt, he's not saying the Egyptian nation, he's not saying the Hittite nation. Notice the word that's going to be established. Peace will be established forever in clause number 1, 2, 3, and 4. And in this treaty, we have the ultimate problem of international relations and international law, and it's this: temporality. Who or what ensures a treaty is enforced from the moment of signing? And who or what ensures a treaty endures from that point onwards? And the answer is a big question. There is no body that can do that. And thus, we have the problem of international relations, otherwise known as the security dilemma. I can make peace with my neighbor. What's stopping my neighbor from violating that peace? Well, we see how they got over it in the next couple of parts. The forever part is a giveaway. How do we conquer the problem of time? How do I prevent one party from violating the treaty? Who are the witnesses? The gods. You see, who holds these parties accountable? It's the gods of the Hittites and the gods of the Egyptians. The very first treaty we have ever any evidence of is the Mesopotamian city-states. The rulers of each Mesopotamian city-state signed, but who enforced it? The god of each city-state. Because each city-state in Mesopotamia, whether it's seeing the moon god, from which we get the word Monday from, or the god of fertility, so on and so forth. You do not upset the gods. A bad ruler violates the treaty, you upset the gods. Now look at the punishment. This is the earliest evidence of sanctions. Who gets punished? Well, not the leader himself, but what the leader owns, the leader's interests. And what are interests? Things that could be divided. The leader's land, servants, and property will be punished by the gods. Can this really be enforced? If the prince of Hittite broke the treaty, will the Hittite gods really punish the prince? No, but it was enough for both sides to basically say, this is what will keep the peace. What will get destroyed? The houses, his land, and his servant. The gods kept the peace. But from this point onwards, we have to say who replaced the gods in international law. And this is when the problem begins. And then sure enough, this is the first example of climate change leading to the collapse of the treaty. The treaty fell apart due to climate change, drought, bad management, bloated bureaucracies. And I just want you to think, and so you have the date here. The treaty was signed in the 1250s, right? This is called the collapse of the Bronze Age. And now I want you to see if this place sounds familiar. When the Hebrews were coming into the desert and going towards this land, what is that? There's Gaza, the ceasefire line. Ceasefire line. This is where ancient Egypt stopped. There's the Hittite, and this was a buffer zone. Because we know we're going to fight over it, the easiest option is to leave this as a buffer zone. This is a conflict management mechanism. I hate to say it, if any of you have Afghan heritage, Afghanistan was a buffer zone. The Russian Empire, the British Empire didn't want to bump up. The British didn't want their territory in India threatened. Russia didn't want its territory in Central Asia threatened. What did they agree to? We'll let this state called Afghanistan separate us so we don't fight. It's the same story of Thailand between the French and British empires in Asia. And in this land, a group of people known as the Hebrews moved in. And we can say the rest is history. Even back then, Gaza wasn't. Even back then, Gaza was important. I want you to look at this. When the Persians conquered Egypt, what did they have to conquer before they could conquer Africa? They had to go through Gaza. This is your old-fashioned geopolitics. Any Persians here? Okay, I knew it. It's the law school. Had to be. Okay, yeah. So even your ancestors had to conquer Gaza. Even your ancestors had to conquer Gaza. And when Alexander went to conquer the Persian Empire, we call him Alexander the Great. The Persians call him Alexander the Jerk. But because he basically burned the Persian capital of Persepolis. But what did Alexander have to conquer before he could go for the heart of Persepolis? Alexander too had to conquer Gaza. There would be no Alexandria had Alexander not marched through Gaza. And Alexander might have been Alexander the Meh if he didn't survive an arrow wound to his leg in Gaza. The only way he recovered from it is a painkiller we're using to this very day, an opium. Alexander was a drug addict as well. And he conquers Alexandria, and the minute he could do that, he could go and conquer Persepolis. Even when the Greeks conquered this land, Gaza kept its name. Even when this empire was a Greek-speaking region. It's the reason that the New Testament that was compiled about events right here was written in Greek. Then we jump to 1777. Something new has happened in all of this. In this story of empires, the two empires we're going at now are the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Empire. And what's happening here? Something a bit different. Because you see on this map, and another very important event happened that we could say really begins international law, the Treaty of Westphalia. It's signed about, it brings the 30 Years' War to an end. Technically, 1648 is when they ink. So just like the Treaty of Kadesh, 1250s. Here we go now. I'll just say 1648 to make it easy. The Treaty of Westphalia was actually a series of treaties. Created, it didn't establish, it created an idea that had to evolve, and that was sovereignty. That was sovereignty. And from this point onwards, now we can start talking about two entities in international law. And the first one is the state. Now, The state as we use it, I want you to think of this word, the state as we use it is the legacy of a Tuscan writer. Now I say Tuscany because Tuscany eventually became the Italian language, and his name is Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli is the first person to refer to a state as a noun, but this is the important thing. The word he used for this state, I want you to think where it comes from. I want you to think of the etymology of it. If Tuscan and Castellano, the language we call Spanish, evolved from Latin, here we get an idea. In Italian, you would write stare as a verb. In Spanish, estar, both evolved from Latin. Machiavelli is using it. Anyone speak Italian? Okay, bravo. Spanish? Okay, yeah, what's the point of asking? Anyway, I want you to think of the following. When you ask this question in Italian, we make it into a verb, right? Come stai? Como stas? What do you ask? Okay, well, how would you respond? First of all, bene in Italian, magari, or bien, I hope. Probably if you're in law school, cansado, or in Italian, stanco. Now, the thing is this. Are you 24 hours of the day tired? I know you're in law school, but you get coffee and you get a jolt, right? You're not. In other words, these are ephemeral, temporal. Fill in the blank. When I say tired, that is an ephemeral, temporal state. It's a feeling. The state was a feeling, right? Now, if I put this verb and ask you in the recent past, right? In Italian, you would say sono stato. In Spanish, he estado, right? I was in the recent past, right? Now, what do you do next? Take away the auxiliary verb, and you're left with a noun, the stato, as we see here. Venetian is just a little bit different than Tuscan. The state, we're left with the state. In Italian, in Spanish, estado, add an S, and here we have the United States of Mexico. Then this other one called the US, yeah, and that we call the US. Okay, there you go. The state was a feeling. In Machiavelli's term, the state was a feeling. And the best state is an apparatus that can project feelings into the citizens. Ideally, a good prince can project into the masses. A good prince at the helm of a state. The best prince could run a state that projects both love and fear. But if I can get you to feel love, Machiavelli says, it's safer to have you fear the state. And everything from that point onwards, I want you to think. And this is a shout out to my fellow Iraqi, Ronson Shamol, who's a faculty member here, who's a tax lawyer. And I want you to ask this question: why would you normally pay your taxes to the state? Why do you pay it? And it's 3 letters. You pay it for the IRS. Right? Because tell me this. Oh man, I got a letter from the IRS. Rocket. Yeah, no, when has that phrase ever been uttered in human history, right? That's gonna cost you fear. And that's why you're gonna pay your taxes around here. Now, the next thing that is new here, not only do we have a state, we have a border. A formal border is now being represented. And this is now the system of international relations is born. Max Weber basically said the most efficient state, so we have Niccolo Machiavelli and Max Weber said the state is defined by that agent that has the monopoly on the use of violence. In other words, I cannot arrest, can you imagine me going up to a sheriff and saying you're under arrest? Okay, I cannot do that, but the sheriff can do that because the sheriff has the monopoly on the use of violence. Okay. Can I put up a stop sign? Anywhere that I want? No, but the state can, and who will enforce you stopping it? Again, either the sheriff, CHP, because they have the monopoly of the use of violence and our system of international relations. So here we go then. Now I go back to my land acknowledgement, the partition. Now, here's my bio. Where have I worked? With UNESCO, UNDP, and NGOs on post-conflict media development. In other words, I helped write media law in Iraq. How do I prevent media from inciting violence against the other? I helped riot it, nobody obeyed it. There was plenty of incitement to violence. The rule of law had yet to take in Iraq after 2003. We're still suffering from the results of that. Now, having said that, here's now my next question for you. Which NGO transformed the international system and world order in the 21st century? So this is for my law students. Answer this question. Which NGO transformed the international system and world order? You know this answer, but I'll let it for everyone. What is the answer I'm looking? What is the NGO I'm looking? And it has to transform the world order as we know it. Does anyone want to give a guess of an NGO? Did I mention NGOs here? I used to teach at the UN University Peace, UNESCO, UNDP, and what are a good example of an NGO? By the way, if anyone has heard, I couldn't have picked a better day to give this lecture because there is a major headline in international law. And I'm building up to that. What NGO transformed the international system in the 21st century? Non-governmental organization.
The United Nations?
Okay, good. I'm glad you said that. I needed somebody to say the United Nations. No, and I'll tell you why. Because it's not I was tricking you. I was trying to set a trap for somebody. Thank you for following. The United Nations is a multilateral. So this is my prompt to set up. What is a multilateral organization? It's made up of many nations. So keep that in mind. The UN is not an NGO because it's a bunch of governmental coming into a single organization. But the point is, it is multilateral. And this is going to set up the rest of this lecture. So any other NGOs?
Terrorist group?
Why would you say a terrorist? You're kind of scaring me. Why would you say a
No, it's
terrorist?
just-
Where are you from, by the way?
I'm from France.
Oh, France. Okay. Yeah. Okay. There you go. A terrorist group. Really?
I was gonna say Greenpeace, but I was like, no.
Yeah. I mean, you should be saying Greenpeace, saving the whales. Look at all these nice NGOs. But did they transform the world as we know? Even the one yes.
I was just gonna say, what's it, the World or the Red Cross?
Red Cross is an NGO created in terms of creating a lot of international norms that govern the conduct of violence. Okay, the Red Cross is a good one. This is the one I used to work for. Unfortunately, it's not the CSI you're thinking of. Child Soldiers International, not crime scene investigation. That's the NGO I'm looking for. And what's your name? Okay, yeah, you got it right. The founder of this NGO is this lanky teenager you're seeing here. And you know him as Osama bin Laden. So yes, now I want you to think of that. Is Al-Qaeda non-governmental? Does it have an embassy? Is there an embassy of Al-Qaeda in New York City? No, that would be too painful and never gonna happen. And it would technically have to be in Washington, sorry, it would have to be a consulate. There is no Al-Qaeda consulate in New York City. Is it an organization? If any of you speak Arabic, look at the word I underline. He is the leader of what? Tanzim al-Qaeda. It calls itself an organization. If it calls itself an organization and is it non-governmental, then is it not an NGO? Okay, yes, so you got my answer. Very good. You can go. Because take right degree and go, yes. Why do we not call it that? Why can't because usually we think of NGOs as actors that do good. Now I'm going to get to what does this mean in international relations. You see, basic, and this whole exercise I'm borrowing from Ulrich Beck, who basically said we live in a risk society. What is Al-Qaeda? It's an NGO committed to violence. Greenpeace tackles the environmental crisis. Terrorist NGOs have the state monopoly of violence in their sights. Okay. In other words, the proper international relations terms is this is a violent non-state actor. And I just added the extra word is transnational. Transnational. In other words, here's the irony. Now look at the word state. If the state is a feeling, what does Al-Qaeda want you to feel? Love and fear. The same thing. Love to get recruits. They want to inspire some. Fear, that's where the terrorism comes in. And what does it want to be? It wants to take away the NON. It wants to become a state. It's using violence to become a state. It wants a monopoly of violence eventually. That's why it exists. So, if none of you have had an IR background, I'm gonna give you an entire IR undergraduate degree through the work of Professor Ryan Gosling, International Relations of Ryan Gosling. Okay, and we already know this is out of date, 2012. Hey girl, I came up with a two-state solution, you and me. Oh, now, of course, yes. Hey girl, in a world, the world is in a state of anarchy and the only two rational actors are you and me. That's realism. That's the realist school of international relations. And realists work like this. The world is in a state of anarchy. When the Prince of Egypt and the Pharaoh of Egypt and the Prince of the Hittites signed a treaty, they were living in a world of anarchy. The gods had to be the only ones who could force two actors in a world of anarchy making peace. Rationally, every state can never trust another state and always will want to expand. And that's what we call the security dilemma. If you believe in this, you are a realist. Trump is a realist. This is what it means for international law. Trump is a realist. Now, let me teach you the other school through Friends, the liberal institutionalism of Friends. So when this meme was produced, we have it produced in a particular time, COVID-19 requires cooperation. COVID-19 requires cooperation. Steal medical equipment from our allies. Okay, now what's happening? Phoebe basically belongs to the liberal institutional school. If realism is about conflict and competition, liberal institutionalism is about collaboration and cooperation. This was produced during the COVID crisis. And this is a reference to Trump. Trump's foreign policy during the COVID crisis. This is competition and conflict. This is not collaboration. And liberal institutionalism, cooperation and collaboration. And France is a good example, or what we could say, multilateralism. Multilateralism is all about cooperation, collaboration. And France is a good example of that. Sharing and cooperating. Sure, how many of these guys shared Rachel? And Joey and Ross? That's liberal institutionalism. Now, compare that to this TV show. This is both unilateral and bilateralism, right? Trump is produced through a reality TV show that was all about conflict and competition. We watch it to see which one of these guys, like the Hunger Games, will be eliminated. That's conflict. This is him acting unilaterally. He's not really cooperating with anyone. And when he says his most iconic term, "you're fired," right? This is his approach to international relations. This is his approach. We created a monster. Trump was a TV fantasy invented for the apprentice. This guy at NBC argues, okay. Basically, yes, we watched the show because we want to see who will he make a deal with bilaterally. One is going to win. And that's the end. Okay, so let's go back to Ryan. Yeah, that way. Okay, so we go from this. You guys need a cuddle. Hey, girl, gender is a social construct where everyone likes to cuddle, and this gets to the next C of international relations: constructivism. And that basically is this: conflict and competition, collaboration and cooperation are all constructed in our minds. It's all subjective. If you come out of the apprentice and see the world that's full of conflict, that's the way the world is going to be. And hey girl, let's go to my place and have a clash of civilizations is also a construct. What kind of construct is it? Well, we go now to the first video. Because who did Trump pick for Secretary of State? Does anyone know?
Marco Rubio.
Marco Rubio, okay. What is Marco Rubio? Now, what I argue is you have to know history to understand. Oh, you got this, you got that? Okay, look at Marco's views. The fact that the comments are turned off on this says a lot. Okay, what is Marco Rubio's view of politics? And here we can get a good idea of what will the State Department look like under a Rubio leadership. It's November 20.
The attacks in Paris are a wake-up call. A wake-up call to the fact that what we're involved in
YouTube is just like, I'm shutting you down. YouTube does not want you. Okay. If the other video works, then we know YouTube has a problem with Marco Rubio. Okay, let's compare it to this. I say the Bush administration. Let's compare Marco Rubio's Secretary of State to the following Secretary of State. Let's look at Colin Powell. The Bush administration was very much a realist one, right? But at least it went through the motions of working through multilateral bodies before the invasion of Iraq. Let's just look at this case. Compare Marco Rubio to even Colin Powell under the Bush administration. And here I'm just giving you a case in which I was involved with.
Coordinated propaganda offensive to embarrassing.
It's February 2003. It's the eve of the invasion of Iraq. It's 1 month before the invasion of Iraq. And ask yourself this, were Trump to invade a country, would he go through the motions that you're watching in this video?
Hit tonight after Downing Street was accused of plagiarism. The target is an intelligence dossier released on Monday and heralded by none other than US Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations yesterday. Channel 4 News has learned that the bulk of this 19-page document was copied from 3 different articles, one written by a graduate student. Our defense specialist, Julian Rush, has the details.
I will try to
On Monday, the day before the US Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN, Downing Street published its latest paper on Iraq. It gives the impression of being an up-to-the-minute, intelligence-based analysis. And Mr. Powell was fulsome in his praise.
I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail.
Sure. Can you guys hear us? All right, let's go back. Okay, so this is Colin Powell, US Secretary of State, a former general. Here he is at the UN. This is the UN General Assembly.
The United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities.
Published on the Number 10 website and called Iraq, its infrastructure of concealment, deception and intimidation, it outlines the structure of Saddam's intelligence organizations. But it made familiar reading to a Cambridge academic.
Many of the words and phrases that it used I recalled from another context. So I searched around the other articles that I'd read on Iraq's organisations, its military and security organisations, and realised that large sections of the British government's dossier were actually copied.
Copied from here, an article last September in a small journal, the Middle East Review of International Affairs. Its author, Ibrahim Al-Marashi, a postgraduate student from Monterey in California.
The document, the British government dossier, is 19 pages long. Most of pages 6 to 16 are copied directly from that document.
Word for word?
Word for word. Even the grammatical errors and the typographical mistakes are copied.
Large sections do indeed appear verbatim. This, for example, 6 paragraphs long on Saddam's special security organisation. The exact same words are in the Californian student's paper. Of military intelligence, Al-Marashi writes, the head of military intelligence generally did not have to be a relative of Saddam's immediate family nor a Tikriti. Saddam appointed Sabir Abdelaziz al-Duri as head. Note the comma after appointed. Downing Street paraphrases the first sentence, but the second is cut and pasted, complete with the same grammatical error. Academics take plagiarism seriously. It's intellectual theft. Downing Street didn't ask for permission to reproduce the work, which is not current, but actually an historical analysis of the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait before the last Gulf War.
He's writing his PhD thesis on the operation of Iraqi forces inside Kuwait, and his primary source of information is documents captured from the Iraqi government in 1991. The information, therefore, that he is using is 12 years old, and he acknowledges this in his article. The British government, when it transplants that information into its own dossier, does not make that acknowledgement. So it is presented as current information about Iraq's current security services, when really the information that it is using are some 12 years old.
Downing Street copied from 2 other articles from the magazine Jane's Intelligence Review. Its editor is happy to be quoted, less happy at the selective way some parts were edited.
What you need to look at is exactly how it's been compiled and collated. And the questions that you're asking about, has certain things been selected for spin, are right questions to be asked.
In several places, Downing Street edits the originals to make more sinister reading. Number 10 says the main intelligence agency is spying on foreign embassies in Iraq. The original read monitoring foreign embassies in Iraq. And the provocative role of supporting terrorist organisations in hostile regimes is weaker in the originals, aiding opposition groups in hostile regimes.
Part of the article.
And an original phrase describing a group made up of bullies and country bumpkins is in number 10's version just bullies. Editing to make Saddam's apparatus look more terrifying, raising questions about the way number 10 is spinning the justification for war.
Julian Rush, well, I called Downing Street for reaction. No minister was available, and intriguingly, actually the Tory opposition didn't want to talk about it either. Downing Street offered this statement. Our report was put together by a range of government officials. The report makes this clear. The contents were drawn from a number of sources, including intelligence material. First paragraph only, I gather. The report does not identify or credit any sources, nor does it claim exclusivity on its contents. We consider the text as published accurate. The Downing Street spokesman would not be drawn on whether this included the typos and spelling mistakes.
Okay, I show that because can you imagine, were Trump to say, I'm going to deploy troops to Mexico?
So what is ClickUp? ClickUp is an all-in-one production.
Would he tell Marco Rubio, go to the UN General Assembly and ask for permission? You can't, if you're shaking your head, you can't imagine that. Because you have a construction in your head, right? Trump would not have gone through the motions of a unilateral body. Now, Colin Powell was sitting in the UN General Assembly. And in that same body in 2003, came up with the following. You see, the Palestine Plan of Partition was one of the first acts of the UN General Assembly. The United Nations was created with the two C's in mind, a multilateral body to ensure collaboration and cooperation. Now, my argument is this. Why do they choose partition as an imperial tool of statecraft? When, if it was a body about collaboration and cooperation, they could have simply told two peoples. Jews who had lived in this land since time immemorial, there was still a community there who spoke Arabic, were raised in Arabic culture. The Arabs who spoke Arabic and were Christian and Muslim, who were the majority, as well as a good number of Jews who had come from Europe. You have a narrow strip of land, work it out. Create some kind of parliament, have representational body, symbolically have a president that's Jewish, a prime minister who's Muslim. The United Nations could have said cooperate and collaborate. Now, why do they say partition? Well, think of the UN Security Council, made up of empires. The British and French, the Soviets and Chinese, and the US. And instead, what they chose was, if you look at this from 1945, if you look at every single one of these intractable conflicts, Cyprus, Northern Ireland, I think of the partition of Northern Ireland, India, Myanmar, the Middle East, South Africa, India, Pakistan. They all have something in common. They were all ruled by the British. And they all had plans of partition, whether it was Bantustans, the creation of Pakistan, Northern Ireland, and Cyprus, all the products of empire. You see, from this point onwards, the Cold War was a realist one. Even though you had the UN could only manage so much. And then what happened after the Cold War collapsed? The first Bush said, I'm going to create a new world order where the UN reigns supreme, but the US will be the dominant actor in it. My doctoral thesis was on a UN Security Council resolution that gave the US the cover to attack Iraq and Kuwait under a UN Security Council resolution. That was collaboration and cooperation, even though there was a conflict with Iraq. Under the Clinton administration, okay, and that's not a mistake. We don't have regimes using makeup. It's rogue regimes. The Clinton administration's policy was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea are the bad actors, but we're still collaborating and cooperating. Then under the second Bush administration, we had a global war on terror. where we had an axis of evil, but a doctrine, and this is what I want to argue, set up a system, a dangerous precedent, is preemptive self-defense. We will act if we determine that there's a clear and present danger. Now, this is the question, how do you determine this? Because from the image I showed you, when Powell went to the UN, not only did he present a dodgy dossier, something that was plagiarized from Brady, but a simulacrum of anthrax, saying Iraq had this much of biological weapons in the past, and this much could take out all of New York City. And thus we have to preemptively invade Iraq to rid it of its biological and chemical weapons. Preemptive self-defense, I just want you to think, how would this work in real life? We saw how it worked out in Iraq. Imagine if I walked into a bar. Imagine again, let's say this hypothetical sheriff that I tried to arrest. What if I told this sheriff as he's putting the handcuffs, no, I was right. When I walked into the bar, I saw a guy and I didn't like his face. And I imagined we would get into a fight later in the evening. So before that could happen, I punched him so that the fight wouldn't erupt and disrupt the entire bar. I didn't like his face. He seemed like a guy I would get into a fight with. So I punched him. So I was the right one. But that is the essence of preemptive self-defense. Now, I want you to see how this argument is being used 20 years later. And then finally, and you notice a lot of American foreign policy could be summed up in 3 words or 2 words or 4 words. Make America great again, right? It's not make the world great again, not make the world safe. Compare the first Bush administration to this. It is a singular vision. And where are we now? Okay, between building a wall and the deal of the century was the first Trump administration's attempt to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But this is the thing with a treaty. If the basis of it is cooperation and collaboration, this was the problem. There was no Palestinian voices in the cooperation and the collaboration of the deal of the century. My argument was the events of October 7th, 2023 were basically saying that the deal of the century wasn't a deal for us. And I mean, think just the title of this peace deal. It sounds like a game show that Trump would have hosted. I mean, if you're on a reality TV show called The Apprentice, I mean, think of this peace deal, right? And now, what do we have? With that term that I introduced into the political lexicon, I take credit for, what was plagiarized from me was called the dodgy dossier. But now it stands as a rubric. And for that, it was a good thing to question any claim. And here it's being used to describe the rationale that was used to discredit the UN agency. Again, the body born out of this multilateral organization. That is so crucial for providing human security in Gaza. And again, when we think of that term, build the wall, here we have an idea. What will the future international law look under the Trump administration? Well, it's the following. If you look at this article, I wrote it in 2019. Remember what happened in Iraq on January 2020. Do you remember the most Googled term on January 1st, 2020? It was not how I get over a hangover. The most Googled term, does anyone know? How did World War I break out? Because what was everyone anticipating? The breakout of World War III. It was prevented because of COVID, but it was an assassination on Iraqi soil, an assassination of an Iranian general. So a general that belongs to a sovereign state killed by a drone. Basically, what did I argue in this article was nothing about the assassination, but the fact that the assassination happened on Iraqi soil, that Trump did not recognize the sovereignty of the Iraqi state. Very much like the way he treated Mexico. In other words, that's a good example of international law under a second Trump administration. Were we that close to World War III? That's not a good precedent for going into the next administration. How was that war avoided? Through a series of tweets. Because neither state has diplomatic relations. So yes, this became his tool of collaboration and cooperation. Now we know that this Twitter logo is now redundant. It's another logo with another actor in international relations. Now, we began this lecture with partition. Will it be replaced with annexation? And now this is the question. What are the indicators? The US Secretary of Defense, not only is not the fact that he works for Fox News, what is one of the greatest violations of international law is you do not touch sacred sites. For other, basically sacred sites should be left alone. But what would this be? Building the third Jewish temple on the Temple Mount would be one example of not only a violation of international law, that would touch World War. I mean, if you want to spark for World War III, I couldn't think of a greater one. Because remember, it was when Israeli Premier Ariel Sharon walked on the Temple Mount by this mosque. That started the Second Intifada in the year 2000. The Second Intifada, I argue, left unresolved issues that literally exploded in October 2020. That's not a good sign. Okay, what about this article 2 days after the election? If America is going to become a petrostate, the other petrostates, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, you name them, are going to have the cover to keep on producing oil without any incentives of encouraging alternative sources of energy. What does that mean for the following treaty? Back in 2020, why was I saying NATO should become a CALO? Is the following, because the Paris Climate Treaty really lost its greatest actor. One of the greatest polluters is no longer a part of the treaty. Okay. Basically, I was saying we have to look for alternatives. But now the question again, this treaty is a voluntary treaty where states volunteer to sign up, just like this other treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. These are the two treaties that are at greatest risk. Because if Iran now were to get a nuclear weapon, and it's never had an incentive to do so, then there are the two major treaties that are so important for the future of global security. A world that keeps nuclear weapons under control, as well as the temperature might be undermined. So, is there any hope? Well, it's a Catholic school, so I do have to say, yes, when we have the failure of one leader, okay, you have surprising, okay, and oh God, this is really embarrassing. Okay, you know what I was looking for at the same time I was thinking. You have the Pope. And then let's not forget, he has the support of Russell Crowe. So yes, this is the future now. And finally, just to conclude, I did not have time to talk about the ICC nor the ICJ, of course, but I'm going to advertise for two other professors in the other campus, San Diego State. We'll be having an event on this on December 5th. And finally, just to conclude, thank you for coming. And I'll now leave the floor open. Sorry I didn't leave much time, but if you do have questions now, we do have the floor is open. Yes, can I?
Well, I guess going back to the you're going to talk about the ICC's amount of warnings today for Netanyahu and Gallant, and I'm just curious if you can break down like how that works, like what states recognize the ICC's jurisdiction.
Okay, so it's just very easy. It's easier to answer which states do not. And it's usually the states that we will associate with war crimes. In other words, it's the US, Russia, China, and Israel are the states that are not members, are not parties to the ICC, which is also now Netanyahu's future vacation options. Do you see what this means? Okay, if neither the US, Russia, or China are parties to the ICC, this basically means these are the only countries he can travel to without getting arrested. That's right, it's a big deal. Now, the ICC's ruling also applied to the leaders of Hamas. The only thing is they've all been killed. So that only leaves Netanyahu and the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who got fired, but still is responsible for whatever happened under his tenure. So basically, if you're a member of the ICC, it means if Netanyahu were to land in your country, let's just say Argentina, if it's cooperating and collaborating with the ICC, would have to arrest them. It also means a lot in terms of flight patterns. Technically, a state now, if we're Netanyahu to fly over the EU, any one of the EU states hypothetically have now the international cover to fly jets and force it to land on their territory and issue the arrest. That, if you want to talk about history and international relations, that's huge. And it's easy enough to understand. And a lot of what I'm arguing is the Trump administration represents continuities from the first Bush administration. It also represents continuities from the Biden administration. After all, it was Biden who failed to re-enter the Iranian nuclear deal. Sure, Trump withdrew from it, but Biden had 4 years to re-enter. He chose not to, or his negotiator. Both the Biden administration and the incoming members of the Trump administration have vehemently criticized the ICC ruling, which again goes to show you there are also continuities from the previous administration, and that's a very good example of it. But if you want to hear this video, I mean, the lecture I gave as yours is part of this entire, this actually is a class that should be a whole semester. And it's hopefully something, if you fight for it, I'll be glad to teach it. But you have access to all the slides. This is just one of the best examinations of the recent ruling. The breakdown with Sean King. So yeah, I highly recommend you watch that, because he just basically, in 9 minutes, basically said, why is this so important? Yeah, very good. Other questions? Can I sue the British government for plagiarizing my work? This is the first thing. Yeah, I'm looking for future learning. Can I sue the British government for plagiarizing my work? What's the answer? No, I don't own the property rights anymore. The journal does. And the journal was scared of suing the British government. Because, you know, they have 007 who could go in and kill you.
Thank you everyone for joining. There'll be a sign-in sheet somewhere. Awesome. Please sign it for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.